Every morning at exactly 6:45, the number 12 bus pulled up to the corner of Maple and Ninth, and every morning, an old woman in a faded blue coat was waiting there. Her name was Margaret. Nobody on the route knew much more about her than that. She carried a canvas bag that looked older than most of the passengers, and she never once had exact change. The driver's name was Elias. He was 34 years old, had been driving that same route for 6 years, and lived in a small apartment above a laundromat with his younger brother, who was still finishing school. Elias did not make much money. He counted coins some nights just to know if he could afford both rent and groceries in the same week. But every single morning, when Margaret stepped onto that bus and reached into her bag with trembling fingers, searching for money that was never quite there, Elias would wave his hand gently and say the same 4 words. Don't worry about it. At first, it was just kindness, the kind of small mercy a tired man extends to an old woman who reminds him of someone. Then it became a habit. Then, without either of them ever discussing it, it became something like a quiet agreement between 2 people who understood loneliness in different forms. Margaret always sat in the 3rd row, always on the right side, always by the window. She would watch the city go by with an expression Elias could never quite read. Sometimes she smiled at nothing. Sometimes her eyes looked very far away, as if she were riding through a version of the city that no longer existed anywhere except in her memory. They rarely spoke more than a few words. "Good morning, Margaret." "Good morning, dear." "Cold one today." "It always is in this part of the world." That was usually the extent of it. But Elias noticed things. He noticed she got thinner over the years. He noticed her coat never changed, only grew more patched. He noticed that on the mornings she didn't come. He found himself glancing at the corner of Maple and Ninth longer than he should, worried in a way he couldn't quite explain to himself. Once, during a brutal January when the heater in the bus had broken and passengers complained loudly about the cold, Elias took off his own jacket at the next stop and laid it over Margaret's knees without a word. She looked up at him, startled, her eyes suddenly wet. She didn't say anything either. She didn't need to. 6 years. 6 years of free rides, of small kindness, of a man who had almost nothing giving a little of it away every single morning to a woman who had, as far as anyone could tell, even less. Then one week in October, Margaret didn't show up. Not on Monday. Not on Tuesday. By Thursday, Elias found himself asking one of the regular passengers, a woman who lived a few streets over from where Margaret usually was, if she knew anything. The passenger's face changed. She said she was sorry. She said Margaret had passed away peacefully in her sleep, in a small house on the edge of town that none of them had known existed. Elias drove the rest of his shift that day in silence. He did not tell anyone what he was feeling because he was not entirely sure himself. Grief for a woman he had known only in 4-word greetings and window-side silences felt strange to explain. But it was there, heavy and real, sitting in his chest like a stone he hadn't asked to carry. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived at the bus depot addressed simply to the driver of the number 12 morning route. The depot manager, confused, handed it to Elias, since everyone knew who that meant. Inside was a request. Margaret's attorney was asking Elias to come to a reading of her will at an office downtown the following Friday at 10 in the morning. Elias almost didn't go. He assumed it was a mistake, or perhaps some small token, a thank you note tucked into an envelope. He requested the morning off, put on the only collared shirt he owned, and walked into an office building made of glass and marble that made him feel, for the first time in years, distinctly out of place. The attorney, a composed woman in her 50s, greeted him by name before he had even introduced himself. She led him into a room where a handful of other people were already seated, none of whom he recognized. She began to explain who Margaret had actually been. Margaret Ellery Whitfield had, decades earlier, founded a small textile company with her late husband. That company, through a series of decisions almost nobody around her ever knew about, had grown into one of the largest logistics and manufacturing holdings in the region. She had stepped back from public life after her husband's death 30 years prior, transferred daily operations to a board she trusted, and lived by her own choice an almost invisible life. She gave away the majority of her fortune anonymously through a private foundation. She rode the bus, the attorney explained, because she wanted to remain among the people her company served, and because, in her own words recorded in a private journal, the only honest conversations left in my life happen on that bus, with a man who has no idea who I am and helps me anyway. The room was silent. Elias felt the floor tilt slightly beneath him. The attorney continued. Margaret had left specific instructions. A modest portion of her estate was designated for various charities she had quietly supported for years. But there was a separate provision, drafted and revised multiple times over the final 2 years of her life. Naming Elias directly, she left him enough to pay off his apartment building outright, with additional funds set aside specifically for his brother's education through to graduate school if he wanted it. She left him a smaller second provision as well, a modest ownership stake in the very transportation subsidiary of her company that operated public routes across the region, along with a letter, handwritten, which the attorney placed gently into his hands. Elias read it alone in his car afterward, unable to open it in front of strangers. The letter did not read like it came from a wealthy woman. It read like it came from an old friend. She wrote that in 30 years of being surrounded by advisors, board members, and people who wanted something from her, the only person who had ever offered her something with absolutely no expectation of return was a tired bus driver who waved his hand every morning and told her not to worry about it. She wrote that she had tested, in her own quiet way, more people than he would ever know, and that nearly all of them, upon learning who she was, had changed how they treated her. Elias never learned who she was until it no longer mattered, because by then the kindness had already happened, freely, without an audience. She closed the letter with a single line. "You gave me back my faith in people, Elias. I hope this gives you back a little of your time." Elias sat in his car for a long while after reading it, the engine off, his hands resting on the wheel. He thought about 6 years of forward greetings. He thought about a jacket laid over cold knees on a January morning. He thought about how easy it would have been to ask her for exact change or to stop noticing when she stopped coming. He did not quit his job. People who knew the story later found that the most surprising part of all, he kept driving the number 12 route for another 2 years, though now the building he lived in belonged to him outright, and his brother went on to finish his degree without a single loan. He simply added one new habit to his mornings. On the 3rd row, right side, by the window, he left a single fresh flower on the seat every day for no passenger in particular, though everyone on that route eventually came to understand exactly who it was for. Word of the story spread slowly through the city, the way true stories sometimes do without press releases or headlines, just people telling other people about a driver who gave rides to a woman he didn't recognize, and a woman who left everything to a man who never once thought to ask for anything. Elias would say, whenever anyone asked him about it, that he hadn't done anything unusual. He said kindness was never supposed to come with conditions attached, or an audience watching, or a return you could calculate in advance. He said the only thing he regretted was that Margaret had spent 30 years believing she had to hide who she was in order to find one honest moment with another human being. He said he hoped, somewhere, she finally understood she never had to hide at all.